Hey everybody, it's me, Angela Walters. Thank you so much for joining me for another live chat. If you are joining live, I can't tell you how much I appreciate it. I go live almost every Thursday at 3 p.m. Central here on my YouTube channel, and I'm excited to talk a little bit about tips for improving your machine quilting. To be honest, I'm feeling a little sick, I'm a little medicated, so I thought, what is something I could talk about that doesn't require, that would be really fun but easy to put together. So when I was thinking about all the tips and suggestions I have for improving quilting that don't really fit in any other conversation, they're just kind of random tidbits, random little facts that I've kind of picked up over the last 20 years of machine quilting. And so hopefully you'll find them helpful. If you're watching live right now, leave a comment because we're doing a giveaway. And I'm giving away one of these pillow panels from our upcoming Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along, our upcoming free class. All you have to do, going blurry, 1 second, I'm going to pause. Well, my camera went blurry when I handed that up there. It's like, no, I don't like it. Anyway, so if you're watching live, just leave a comment and we'll pull a winner at the end. So let's get into the tips and suggestions that I have. First of all, last week's live chat, I talked about the new upcoming dot-to-dot Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along. That's starting January 2nd. If you want to learn more about that, you can check that out on my YouTube channel. I have my previous week's live chat, and it's going to be a lot of fun. So click the link in the description box if you want to get registered for the free class, or if you want to purchase any of those products that we have that go with it. The videos are going to come out January 2nd. I know if you watch my live chats, I know I have so many regulars, you already know this, but you're going to see we have some different, the schedule of things coming up. So super, super excited for that. All right, so when I was thinking through some of these tips that I'm going to share, again, they're just kind of random. Think of them like popcorn. It just kind of pops up, and I was thinking, what kind of things can I share and help out with? Now, if you're watching live, Jessica is here, as always, behind the camera, and she is writing down any questions you have. So if you're like, ooh, I wish I knew this, well, all you have to do is slip her $20, leave a question, and you might get it answered live. No, I'm just kidding. It's $100. No, I'm just kidding. The problem is when I'm taking cold medicine, I think I'm funnier than I actually am. But Jessica's laughing with me, so it's fine. It's fine. But you can leave your questions, and she'll help you out with that and give them to me, and I'll answer them live. If you're not watching live, no worries. Just leave them in the comments, and either I get on there or other quilters are really helpful to help out. Okay, so when I thought through the tips for machine quilting, how can you make your quilting look even better than as best as it can look without actual quilting? So these are tips that are not specific to the actual process, right? So, I mean, I wanted to give you some information that was maybe something you haven't heard somewhere. We know if you are quilting, you need a free motion foot. There's just things that are kind of more basic. So all these tips have nothing to do with the actual quilting. It's just the before and the after and the tips that help make your quilting process a little bit easier and more fun. I kind of put them in rough categories. So first up, thread selection. When you're picking out your thread colors, in general, I think a lighter thread looks better on darker fabric. Not only does it still give you the texture of the quilting, but it just helps cover some of those, unintentional quilting customizations. So the rule that I give myself that I follow is I'll say, okay, if I can't decide between two thread colors, I almost always opt for the lighter one. So that's just a little tip that I think is really helpful, especially if you want the quilting to show up too much. Now, if you want a pop of color or you want the quilting to contrast a little, but without being like darker, you can go brighter or go in a different color, but same value. So for instance, if you've ever been to a quilt show where there's long arms lined up, almost all of them have dark black fabric with neon colors on it. That's because it looks so good on that fabric. So you can still get that contrast without actually using the lighter color. All right, so I got some examples. Everything okay?
You're a little blurry.
I know I'm blurry. I can't get it to fix, guys. I'm sorry. 1 second. Let me pause one more time. I'll try to fix it. My camera just kind of messed up on me. Let's see if that works. It's a little bit better. All right, sorry. I'm a little blurry. Okay. This is an example of contrasting thread. If you watch any of my videos, usually I'm using a darker thread on lighter fabric so you can see what the quilting looks like. But as you can tell, you can see every little thing. And when you're practicing, that's a good thing. But on an actual quilt, if you don't want the quilting to overwhelm it, using a thread color that is more similar to the quilt top will really help you out there. There's other things to take into consideration, like the weight of the thread and the type of thread. But in general, using a lighter thread color 1 or 2 shades lighter is going to give you a really nice result. Here's an example of that pop of color, right? So it's a dark blue background. It is a gold thread. It's maybe a touch lighter than the background, but it's similar in value, but it looks really, really nice. So if I'm going to go with contrast, I usually try to opt for a brighter color against that background. Now, I do need to pause and say this is just my preferences and my opinion, so you can take that for what it's worth. When it comes to selecting the thread color, just remember you can do whatever you think looks good. All right, when you're picking your thread colors, if you want, to match your threads to the different fabrics, which I usually do, be encouraged. You don't have to use a different thread color for every piece of fabric. Usually, thread can blend across a range of colors. So in this example, I just kind of pulled this picture from last year or a couple years Build-A-Quilt. You can see I have a lot of different fabrics, but these are the 4 colors that will hit all of those tones. So usually you can find a thread that will go over a range of colors. It takes a little bit of trial and error to find what you like, but it's really nice because you get that custom look without changing the thread every single fabric. Another reason that I love to use lighter thread on darker fabric is I can creatively fix some mistakes. So in this example, this is being very nitpicky and very granular. I would not worry about this, but you can see where that pin is pointing, and there's an area where my pink thread just kind of hopped over that black area. And so instead of ripping that out, I can use a fabric marker to color it in. Now, this is a little questionable. You have to kind of decide what you want to work with that, but if it's driving you nuts, it's a great way to cover it up. So there I just use a fabric marker to color in that color. If it's a darker thread, I'm not going to have that option, right? Because I'm not going to bleach it or lighten it. And another example here. Again, this is getting very granular, but it's meant to, illustrate a point. So let's say you're doing white thread around a black fabric just like this. If you veer off, you can always color in with that fabric marker to make it look better. Now, I should say, I'm going to pause. Don't do any of this and expect to win a ribbon at a show. I'm just talking about making you happy with the results of the quilting. And of course, your mileage may vary. Test out that fabric marker before you start, or just think, you know what, it looks fine. I think it's going to be great. All right, moving on to fabric selection. This is something I'm kind of excited to talk about because it's something you start thinking of before you even finish the quilt top. The fabrics and the colors that you pick will make the quilt easier or more difficult to quilt. Now, that's not to say you shouldn't do what you want, but just know that the fabric you pick is going to play a huge role. Now, quilting for customers, you don't get that option, but if you're making your own quilt, then you can definitely make some selections there. First of all, be wary of solid white backgrounds. Nothing looks better than a solid white background, right? Those blocks pop off of it. But what happens is when you start quilting, it compresses those layers and shows anything that's underneath it. So for instance, if somebody wanted to make white blocks or white background with black blocks, there's going to be area where the black threads are going to show up underneath. And that's fine. Just know that that's going to happen. Or if you are basting your quilt sandwich on the floor or floating your quilt top on a long arm, you might pick up some errant threads as you're working. So just be wary. You don't have to not do it, but just know that you might have some issues with that. Now, if you get into a situation where maybe a hot pink thread has worked its way somehow underneath your white background and you can really see it, but it's already quilted, you could use something like this. This is a soft touch thread pick. It's basically a teeny tiny crochet hook, just the teeniest little hook, and you work it in between the fibers of the fabric very carefully, and you hook that thread and bring it out. It's not fun. I mean, it's not quick. It takes a while, but it's going to be a better result. So if you do use that solid white background or a light tonal fabric, just know you can remove those, but just know. Okay, so picking your backing before you get started depends on how comfortable you feel with your quilting. I love backing fabric that is solid and contrasts with the front because it means I'm going to be able to see the quilting on the back. It's like a two-sided quilt. But if you don't want to see that or you're having some tension issues here and there, a busier fabric will hide the quilting. So you can just use that as an idea. For instance, I don't have it here, but big yellow Impracticality quilt. It's on everything. I was really struggling with tensions, and so I did a very bold fabric on the back. Like that way people won't see it. Again, if you're entering a quilt show, that's not going to help you. The judges will still see it. But if you're just like going to, make it for yourself and you want to not see the tension issues, and using the fabric will help. Now, when you're picking out fabric for the quilt top, if you have a lot of contrast in the colors, you may need thread changes if you want to do it that way. Let's say you have a black quilt, black border, white center. You could just do one color over the whole thing, but if you're planning on picking out your thread colors, then just know that you might have to add more colors in there. I will tell you, the one thing I hated to see as a quilter for customers, professional quilter, I guess, is if somebody had like a black border with a white inner border, like that's 2 inches, because it's a boundary I can't jump over with my black thread, and that means more starts and stops. Again, doesn't mean I can't do it. It just means I need to know, oh, this is going to give me some issues. So for instance, this particular quilt I did for Tula Pink, it's gorgeous. All the different thread, colors and the way it, works through the quilt. That quilt right there took me probably longer than almost any quilt that I've done for her because of all the starts and stops, because I had that different thread colors, right? So there's a light and the dark, and I knew it would take all those thread changes. Now, I do it because I love her, and that's fine, but just know going into it that that's what you're gonna get. So for instance, this particular quilt's pretty drastic, but black solid, white solid. If I had to pick one thread color to go over the whole thing, I would do a light gray. I'd split the difference. But since I do match the threads to the background, then I have to change thread colors. So again, that different contrast is just gonna maybe make an extra step or two. So an example of this would be this quilt. It's so funny because Fuzzy Face Place was just asking about this quilt, so it's kind of funny. The background is a dark gray and prints for the stars. Gorgeous, right? Nice contrast, but it's not so much contrast that I can't get away with using one thread color over the whole thing. Those prints are busier, which will help hide the contrast, and then the background is a little bit more subtle. So in this instance, I could do a light gray over the whole thing. But another quilt I did for her, which is just real close up, is this one. That's such a drastic contrast, right? The background is solid black. Those blocks are solid colors. I just knew that it's not gonna work to do a black over the whole thing. So you can't always control this, or sometimes you don't wanna control it. But if you're on a time crunch and you're making it for somebody as a favor and you just wanna make it kind of quick, that might be an option there. One other thing to consider is the type of fabric. Linen fabric is gorgeous. I love quilting it because that looser weave just kind of takes care of most tension issues. And the thread doesn't show up on linen fabric as much as it does on solid fabric, even though it is technically a solid. I think it has to do with the texture of that print. So just know that if you have a linen background or linen blocks, you can get away with a little bit more contrast in your thread color. So this is just a random picture I found from years ago that I quilted. Linen background, that texture looks nice. I think it's quilted with like a yellow color or something, but you can get away with a little bit more than I could, for instance, this section, which is solid black fabric. So just know that linen you can get away with a little bit more. All right, how about tension tips? Okay, so some of this might seem obvious, but it's worth repeating. Check the stitching on the back after you change your bobbin. Now, when we talk about tension issues, usually it's along the beginning part of your learning curve. And so just checking any of those variables as you go will save you from a lot of heartbreak. And I know there's some of you watching right now that know what that heartbreak feels like, right? You're on your long arm and you're advancing the quilt and it rolls around and you see the back and it's bad. And you've already done a whole big section, or you finish the whole quilt on your sewing machine and you flip it over and see it. So just check it. I always kind of start over on the edge and kind of flip it over if I need to. And then don't make any big changes before starting an important quilt or one with a deadline. Sometimes I get that way. I'm like, oh, I'm going to clean everything off. I'm going to do all these things. If it's working, just roll with it and then do any changes, any big changes afterwards. For instance, if I need to get it serviced or whatever. Again, I'm just trying to limit any of those variables so I don't have any of those tension issues. And I've done a couple live chats on thread, needles, and tension. I probably will do that again coming up pretty soon because it's such a good topic. Okay, for those of you that are new to machine quilting or quilting for customers, I always think it's great to always use the same kind of thread. It removes more of that variable that can affect tension. So when I quilted for customers at the time, I only used So Fine thread, and so because it comes in 5 million colors, it'll work, and it just keeps those variables low. Now, as you get more comfortable with the machine quilting process, of course, you can try all the different threads, but when you're just starting out, just kind of keeping things as even as possible or similar as possible will help make that just a little bit easier. Okay, this is a little bit more vague, but it really will help. For those of you that are quilting on a long arm, the way the long arm works, it doesn't have tension discs that open up and close depending on the foot position. So that's why we can't really do this on a sewing machine. But if your machine is working great and tension is exactly how you want it, go to your machine and pull the thread out of the needle so that's threaded throughout the whole machine, just not the needle, and pull it and see how tight that feels. See what that feels like when everything is good. And that way you'll know when you're having issues, how's that top thread working? So let's say Jessica's quilting on her long arm. She's having thread problems. She's calling me. She's going to throw it in the garage or garbage. She hates me, all this. I would come over, bring her wine because I know it makes her happy. And then I would try to talk her down. But the first thing I would do is feel how that top threading feels. It's going to be a lot tighter than you might think. So that way you know, okay, if it feels really loose, if it snaps, I'll know that there's an issue there. So just knowing what it feels like when it's right will help you when you're not. Again, this is another one just for the long armers, but watch out for those tension discs. On a sewing machine, those tension discs, and on a long arm, they control the tension on that top thread. On a sewing machine, when you raise that presser foot, it opens up the discs, right? But on a long arm, those are always closed. So what can happen is as you're quilting, especially if it's with a slicker thread or a shiny thread, or sometimes it just happens, the thread will come out of that tension disc. It'll look right, and it'll look like everything's fine, but there's no tension on the top thread. And then, being the smart person that I am, I would tighten the top tension, because it's obviously too loose, but the thread is not in the tension discs, and all I'm doing is making another problem to fix. So if I start having tension issues, I pull my top thread, I'm like, oh, that's really loose. That's the next place I'm going to look. And I have just a quick little video. This is just specific to Handy Quilter, but all the long arms have that. It's so close, it looks like it's one piece, but it's actually two separate discs. So just watch out to that part right there. We sell Handy Quilter long arms, and in our training sessions, I spend a lot of time on that right there because it will just make your life miserable if the thread's not where it needs to be. Okay, design selection. The quilting designs that you pick can play a big role in how the quilting looks or how happy you are with the result. So if I'm using contrasting thread, and we'll see an example of this here in a second. For instance, there's a black background and a bright block, and I'm like, I'm not changing thread colors, we're just gonna roll with it. I like to keep the designs more basic, more simple looking, that way it doesn't draw too much attention. If you think about swirls or things with traveling, it has more thread buildup and it's gonna draw attention to that area. So when I'm using contrasting thread, I like to do more geometric shapes or shapes that are very basic in how they go together so they're not too fussy. Again, that's kind of just my opinion there. I have an example, I'll show you that in a second, but what you put around a design, the filler, is just as important as the design itself. The filler you put around it is going to determine whether that design shows up or hides. And I know I've talked about this several times, so those of you that have watched the live chats before probably have already heard me say this. But if I quilt a block or a motif and I don't like it, or I want it to be more subtle or blend in, I'm going to put similar designs around it, right? So if I do a big feather, I'll do some big swirls around it so it just kind of blends in. Now that seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like, how is putting more stuff around it going to help it go away? Well, it's kind of like a crowd, right? Getting lost in a crowd. So keeping everything similar will help that out. The analogy I like to give when I'm teaching classes is, let's say we all took a huge group picture with all the thousands of people that are watching this live chat, and there was one clown in the photo. We would see that clown. It's going to stand out, right? But what if everybody was a clown? They all blend in with each other. So think about that way. If I love the design and I'm like, well, heck, I want to show it off, or I'm super happy with how it looks, then I'm going to put something different around it. So denser, different shape, maybe a tighter fill to make it pop up. So just knowing how you can be creative with that and help hide some things or show some things off will really, really help you out. And this is just a suggestion, but don't quilt several difficult designs on a quilt. Nothing is more stressful than that, right? So let's say I get my quilt, I spent all this time, and I'm like, I'm gonna make this the best quilting job I've ever done, and I'm gonna do super difficult stuff over the whole thing. Now, if I'm entering a quilt show, yeah, I'm gonna do that. But on an actual quilt, I like to pick one or two more difficult for me or more complex looking designs, and then keep it a little bit more easy across the rest of it. So it's just kind of where you're gonna get the most return on your quilting time investment. So for instance, If I have very busy fabric, you're not going to see the quilting anyway. It's going to get a nice big swirl. If you can see the quilting, then you'll be able, if it's a solid fabric, then I might do something a little bit more impactful there. So this is just an example I had of keeping the quilting a little bit more basic in those blocks. In this example, it was a quilt for Tulip Pink, and I was using a dark gray background or thread in the background to match that background fabric. And I knew I didn't want to change colors of thread and have a new start and stop for every one of those blocks. I am a little bit lazy. Well, we'll say efficient. I'm quilting efficiently. So within those blocks, since that medium gray thread is just a little bit darker than the fabric, I kept the quilting nice and basic, just geometric, nothing too fussy, nothing too frilly, just to help keep it from being like, whoa, there's all that quilting. All right, this is another one of those vague things, and hopefully you can start to see why it all kind of comes lumped into this one live chat, the mechanics of quilting. I can't tell you how important it is. The height of your machine and your posture will make a huge difference for your quilting, no matter what kind of machine you're using. If you're quilting on a sewing machine, what I don't want is to have the machine so high that I'm T-Rexing, like acting like a T-Rex dinosaur. I want to be able to push down and use gravity on my side for that. So if you need to put extra pillows under your seat, if you need to adjust your chair, having that right, height will really help you out. And same on a long arm, having it comfortable for you to quilt is going to be important because you want to be able to have great control. So if it's too low, you might have a tendency to bend down, or you might have difficulty seeing where you're going. So just make sure you have it where you want it to be. And then know your control zone. I thought this is so, if I just left it this, we'd have no idea what I'm talking about. But when you're quilting on a long arm or a sewing machine, you have most control when your hands are right in front of you. On a sewing machine, when they're on either side of the needle, or on a long arm right in front of you. So knowing that means I don't want to get too far away from my machine, especially if I'm trying a design that's newer to me or one that requires a lot of control, like small pebbles. So make sure you know, like, this is where I have my control and this is where I'm going to get the best quilting. Now, for those of you on a long arm, it's super tempting to want to use that whole throat space, right? You're like, I paid for 24 inches of throat space. I'm using everything. Well, that's great. But if you're doing some designs that are smaller or require that more control, I'm not going to have that control way out here or way up here. I'm going to have it right here. So I'm going to move that quilt. I'm going to advance it back and forth where I need it. So again, just kind of as you're quilting, check in with yourself in a non-weird way. Like, how's this feeling? What can I do to make it easier? And you might see that be helpful there. When possible, load your backing if it's pieced so that the seam is running parallel to the bar. Not always possible, but it does make the loading process a lot easier. If it's running perpendicular to the bar, as you roll up, that seam is going to get bulkier and bulkier, and the sides are going to shift, and that's where we can kind of get tucks sometimes. As opposed to loading it with the seam running with the bar, it just kind of goes around it once, and then it's done. So if possible, that will really help. And the last one, this is going to sound so weird, so important. Do not smooth the fabric. I know what we want to do. We want to pet it. We want to smooth it. We want to move it around, but fabric will shift, and we don't want that to happen. This is the case whether you're basting your quilt sandwich or you're working on your quilt on your long arm. It's going to be very tempting to want to smooth it flat. And sometimes that's great. If your quilt is perfectly pieced, it's going to be flat and square. If I pieced it, it's not going to be flat. I'm going to show you what that looks like here in a second. But resist the temptation to smooth, especially if you're on a long arm and especially if you're floating your top, because it will shift after time. You want to keep any fullness where it's at. So I pulled together an example. Now, I pieced this quilt. So I can show pictures of the horrible piecing. I would never show pictures of this if it were somebody else's quilt. But we know I'm a better quilter than a piecer, and one of the benefits of being proficient with quilting is I know how to fix a lot of mistakes, a lot of piecing mistakes. So this example, I get to the bottom of the quilt, and there is a ton of fullness in this one block. Well, first of all, if you're piecing the quilt top, you know if you have fullness. You know if you had to smush that in there or stretch it out. So you already kind of have a heads up on that. But when I have fullness like this, it's tempting to want to smooth it flat, but what that's going to do to my corners is going to make my quilt not square. It's going to kind of flare out at the side. So instead of smoothing, I'm going to tack it right where it's at, tack it down so that I can then fill it in. The great thing about quilting is that it will suck up some of that fullness. Sometimes that works against us, but in this instance, we're going to use that to work with us. So here we can see in progress, as I loaded that quilt, started quilting, I'm like, ooh, teachable moment. Let me take some pictures. You can see I stabilized the bottom. I'm doing this on my long arm, but this would be the same on a sewing machine. Instead of quilting one straight line across that bottom edge, which will push the fabric around, I'm doing more like a serpentine line or kind of like a tack, just to kind of hold that in place. This fullness, if I keep putting it off, it's just going to compound and give me more trouble. So again, I want to hold it where it's at and use the quilting to squish it down. Sometimes you might have to take a tuck, and tuck where you just fold the fabric on top of each other. It happens. Call it ruching, call it textured quilting. Do whatever you need to do, but just keep going. It's not going to be the end of the world. But usually I can get away without not getting a tuck. So once I have that tacked in place, then I can start quilting. And fabric can be manipulated. So I can kind of holding the fabric, moving it around. And I'm okay if there's a wrinkle. I'm okay even if there's a tuck, but it's not a tuck unless the fabric is folded on itself. So even though some of these wrinkles might look like tucks, they're not yet. So I'm just trying to manipulate that fabric so that I don't create a tuck if possible. Once I have the main element, then I'm going to start adding my quilting. It's going to suck up some of that fullness. Again, that can be bad for us sometimes, but in this instance, we're going to use it to our benefit. And then when I'm done, I have that block that's perfect. So it was crazy. And you can see the top of that feather where I haven't quilted yet. There's that fullness. Or even in some of those petals, you can see some wrinkling, but it's not a tuck. I always tell people it's not a tuck unless it's folded. So you can see example of that, and then I have that whole quilt. Creatively fixing quilt problems, that's something that will come with practice. And you know, the good thing about me being such a horrible piecer is I get plenty of practice of that. But just know that you can make some creative quilting to hide those. All right, this is quick, and I'm one last slide, one more picture, and then we'll move on to your questions. Check your quilt top for holes. It's kind of that whole thing, like an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Even if you pieced it, go ahead and check for it. Because if there's a hole in the piecing, I want to know before I get my machine stuck into it. If I get my machine stuck into that hole, not only do I have to try to get it unstuck, it can compromise the piecing that is there. So being really aware of where that's at and just watching that out. Also along the sides as you're working around. Trim any loose piecing threads that are hanging around. You don't want that to get stuck on your foot. That's not fun. And of course, make sure the backing is bigger than the top, even if you're quilting on a sewing machine. You might think, well, I don't need the extra like I do on a long arm, but having even just a couple inches of extra fabric on the back will give you something to hold on to when you're quilting along the edge of the quilt. And lastly, but most importantly, have fun with it. If you feel like quilting a frickin' spider web on the quilt, then you do that. Like I tell my kids, you do you, boo, but have fun with it. Quilting is meant to be fun, so try not to overthink it or to worry too much about those things. Now, of course, there's a lot of different tips and other suggestions, and I'm sure you have plenty, so you should leave those in the comments if you have some that I missed. But do you have any questions coming up? Usually comes up. Now, next week is Thanksgiving, so we won't be here, but we'll be back 2 weeks from now, so it'll be fun. For a quilt with a black background, but blocks in all different thread colors, what thread color would you recommend? So one thread color, I'd go light gray, usually. But it also depends on what's the most important thing. If you're like, oh my gosh, these blocks are the best, I don't want anything to contrast in them, then I would pick the thread for that area and then just let the background show up. So what's the name of the fabric pin that I use? It depends on what I have laying around. Pigma pins, you need something that's color fast, something that's meant for staying on fabric. But I haven't been against using a Sharpie before. No, never did that on a customer quilt, only on mine. When I change thread colors, do I change the bobbin color as well? And this is one I almost put on as a tip, but I didn't end up doing that. Yes, especially if you're newer to quilting, using the same color thread on the top and bobbin will help just hide any pokies or inconsistent tension. Even if it's not the exact color of the top thread, if it's in a range, that kind of helps. So I do. How do I choose thread when the top is very light and the back is very dark? So when the backing is contrasting from the top, I don't even worry about the backing. I jokingly say, or I tell my customers, I can only worry about one side of the quilt. Which side should it be? Usually the pieced side. So if I have a light quilt top, I'm picking the thread color based on that only. And that means when I'm done and I turn the quilt over, I have a beautiful double-sided quilt, and I would tell the customer I didn't charge them extra for that. So that kind of plays into that picking the backing fabric. If you don't want to see the quilting at all, using a similar color will help that out. Do I always use polyester thread on my long arm? Yeah, not always, but like 99.99% of the time. Cotton is great for quilting. So if you love cotton thread, or if you are piecing and quilting on the same machine, I'm always saying that's great. Keep the same thread in there. That, again, reduces those variables. But it totally just depends on your preferences. I mean, it's not like there's any rule on that, so you can kind of have fun. Any tips on making the quilt sandwich so you don't get bunching? Well, the more time you invest into the stabilizing process, the better the results will be. Now, there is like a return, like you can spend an insane amount of time, and it's not going to make it that much better. So just know, like, taking your time, making sure that it's stabilized, consistently throughout, it will help with the bunching. Another thing is not about the sandwich, but when you're quilting, try not to twist the quilt while you're quilting. I mean, you can rotate it, but what happens is sometimes people start shifting it all, every which way, and that creates that tux on the back. How do I know how much design to put on a quilt? Well, since I am the expert of my opinion, I just consult with myself, but it just depends on your preferences. Truly, there's no right or wrong answer. When it comes to how much design to put on the quilt, it usually has to do with how bored I get quilting a particular design, and so I might quilt more or less. It just kind of depends on that. Do I have any new Midnight Quilter episodes? We've got some in the hopper. We got some coming out before too long. Getting this upcoming Free Motion Challenge quilting along, getting it ready and kind of launching that has taken up quite a lot of the bandwidth. So don't look for any new episodes until after the first of the new year, but definitely one of my fun highlights to do. All right, I hope everybody has a great next week. For those of you that celebrate Thanksgiving, I hope that you have a happy Thanksgiving. And one person's going to be super thankful for a new project. So Scarlett Ragus, email us at our website, quiltingismytherapy.com. There's a contact me form. You can send us your email address or your address, and we'll get that sent out to you. So let me know if you enjoy these tips. Leave a comment if I missed something that you think would be super helpful. And if you found any of them helpful, I hope you'll give the video a thumbs up. It really does help YouTube know that, hey, this content's pretty good and we want other quilters to find it too. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you back in 2 weeks, and we'll do another live chat on Thursday, 3 p.m. Central. Until then, everybody, happy quilting.